In the spring of 1968, Doris Day was one of the most commercially successful entertainers in the world. She had topped the box office 5 times in a single decade. Her records had sold in figures the industry press at the time placed in the range of 20 to 30 million units. The company she and her husband had built together, Arwen Productions, its music subsidiaries, its publishing arms, represented something close to $20 million in accumulated earnings. The morning after Martin Melcher was buried, she found out she was $450,000 in debt. Melcher had died on April 20, 1968, of an enlarged heart, a condition he had declined to treat because he practiced Christian Science and had, apparently, trusted God and his attorney in roughly equal measure. He was 52. What he left behind was an estate valued at approximately $1 million on paper, a wife who had no idea what her own finances looked like, and a Beverly Hills lawyer named Jerome Rosenthal, who had been managing every dollar she had ever made since 1953. Rosenthal moved first. Before Day had retained her own counsel, before she had even begun to understand the shape of what had happened to her money, Rosenthal filed suit against the estate. His claim that he and Melcher had a private oral agreement giving him 50% of the entire Day-Melcher empire. No paperwork, no written acknowledgement anywhere in his files from the 5 years preceding Melcher's death. Just a claim, lodged against a dead man who could not dispute it, by the attorney who had handled every transaction those two men had ever made together. The California courts would eventually describe this claim as unsupported by a single scintilla of proof. That came later. The story of how Day lost $20 million begins not in 1968, but in 1953, and it begins not with theft, but with a decision that had every reason to look correct. She was 31 years old and at the front edge of the career that would define her. Her first marriage had produced a son and ended quickly. Her second, to a man named George Weidler, lasted 8 months. Martin Melcher, whom she married in April of 1951, was different, a former agent who understood the industry, who spoke its language, and who, from the moment they married, took over the management of her professional life so completely that she later described herself as having simply handed everything over and trusted him to handle it. That trust was not naive. It had a logic. Melcher was effective. He renegotiated her Warner Bros. Contract, then pulled her out of it entirely and repositioned her as a freelance actress, a move that gave her the career flexibility to make Pillow Talk and Lover Come Back and the sequence of films that made her the #1 box office draw in America. He acquired the story rights to Pillow Talk for $10,000. The film grossed $13 million. He built the infrastructure around her earnings: Arwen Productions, Arwen Records, Arwen Music, Daywin Music, Mart Music, Artists Music, 6 separate corporate entities, each one another wall between her income and any single point of failure. And then, in May of 1956, he introduced her to Jerome Rosenthal. Rosenthal was a Beverly Hills attorney, and what Melcher needed him to be was a single person who could serve simultaneously as lawyer, accountant, investment advisor, and business manager. One person with access to everything, answerable to no one except the 2 men who shared adjoining offices at 250 North Cannon Drive. The retainer agreement they signed on May 11th gave Rosenthal 10% of everything the Melchers owned and earned. Day signed it without being informed that she had the right to consult independent legal counsel before doing so. The trial court would find, 18 years later, that Rosenthal had never adequately explained to her what that document meant. 10% of everything for life. What Rosenthal then did with the access that agreement provided took the courts 99 days to fully document. Around 1960, he began directing the Melchers' capital into instruments that had one thing in common: they failed. Oil wells in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kentucky, cattle ranches that produced no cattle of financial value, hotels and motels whose books showed operating losses that predated Rosenthal's involvement and deepened after he directed funds into them, racehorses. The specific legal term the court would later use for these investments was speculative. The specific dollar figure lost in the hotel ventures alone was over $3 million, every cent of it gone. The fees came alongside the losses. Between 1953 and 1968, Rosenthal collected $2.5 million in disclosed payments from the Melchers for his services. That figure, the court was at pains to note, did not include other monies he acquired without their knowledge or consent. The investments were not simply bad judgment, they were riddled with undisclosed conflicts of interest. Rosenthal was not a disinterested advisor recommending deals that happened to fail. He held interests in the entities he was directing the Melchers' money into. He charged both sides of transactions. He double-billed for legal fees. He overstated expenses. In some instances, he was, in effect, paying himself twice from the same transaction. Then came what the trial record describes as leverage. Day's fortune was not held in a simple account. It flowed through royalty contracts, film percentages, and corporate publishing structures so layered that real-time oversight was essentially impossible. Melcher and Rosenthal borrowed against her music contracts for compositions she had not yet recorded. Future creative output pledged as collateral for debts she did not know existed to service investments she had not authorized. By the time Melcher died, the declared fees alone exceeded $2.5 million. The hotel investments had consumed $3 million more, and what two men in adjoining offices could quietly extract from a $20 million enterprise across 15 years had been extracted. Day found this out from her son. Terry Melcher, her son from her first marriage, adopted by Martin, walked her through it in the days after the funeral. The debt, the CBS advance for a television series she had never agreed to make and that Melcher had signed her to using his power of attorney. The borrowed against song catalogs, the failed wells, the hotels, and the gap between what she had spent her career building and the figure that remained when you added it all up. She has never publicly described that conversation in detail. What she said later about Melcher, and this is the sentence round which the entire moral weight of this story rotates, was that she believed he had simply trusted the wrong person. Whether that belief was accurate is the question the trial judge addressed directly, and his answer was not the one Day offered. Judge Lester Olson, who sat through 99 days of testimony and 14,451 pages of transcript from 67 witnesses, found that Melcher and Rosenthal had shared adjoining offices, each keeping a close eye on the other, each knowing how cunning and deceptive the other was. The phrase "blind awe" appears in the record. It describes Melcher's posture toward Rosenthal. It does not describe the conduct of a man who did not know what was being done. And there is one fact from this period that does not appear in any of the financial tables or legal briefs, but which belongs here. In the early 1960s, Day discovered that Melcher had been unfaithful. She wanted a divorce. Melcher told her that dismantling the financial empire they had built together would cost them a substantial portion of their fortune. They remained married in name only. The empire, her empire, built on her voice, her image, Her willingness to make films she did not want to make was also the cage that kept her from leaving. Melcher had signed her to Do Not Disturb and Caprice and Where Were You When the Lights Went Out, films she objected to, that damaged her standing with critics, that her husband had committed her to because he held power of attorney over her professional life. When the producer of The Graduate sent Melcher the source novel, Melcher found it offensive and never showed it to his wife. Anne Bancroft played Mrs. Robinson. The film made her an icon of a new kind of cinema. Day spent 1967 making Caprice. Day filed suit in February of 1969. Rosenthal had already been in court for months. What followed was 13 consolidated cases, 18 legal proceedings launched by Rosenthal against his former clients using confidential information he had acquired through the attorney-client relationship he was simultaneously claiming to have honored. On September 18, 1974, Judge Olson delivered his oral decision. He found that the case, from beginning to end, oozed with attorney-client conflicts of interest. Rosenthal was held liable for legal malpractice, breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and abuse of process. The initial compensatory award came to over $22 million. The final judgment, entered March 31, 1975, was $26,396,511, including $1 million in punitive damages. Rosenthal declared bankruptcy. Day eventually settled with his liability insurers for $6 million to be paid in 23 annual installments, 23 cents on the dollar, spread across nearly a quarter century. He was disbarred by the California Supreme Court on July 13, 1987, 19 years after Day's initial complaint to the state bar. The delay, largely produced by Rosenthal's own obstruction, exposed a structural failure in the discipline system serious enough that it became a direct cause of reform. California established its full-time professional state bar court in September of 1989. In its first decade of operation, the court reviewed more than 11,000 disciplinary matters, a caseload the part-time volunteer panel it replaced could not have managed. Rosenthal died in Los Angeles in 2008. He had spent his final years filing suit against the state bar, its employees, and the justices of the California Supreme Court who had disbarred him. Every case was dismissed. Day outlived him by 11 years. She died in May of 2019 at 97. She had spent the last decades of her life running an animal welfare foundation she founded herself, not through Arwin, not through Rosenthal's structures, but directly, with oversight she controlled. Go back to the morning after Melcher's funeral. A woman who had been told for 15 years that she had a financial empire, who had been made to stay in a marriage on the grounds that leaving it would cost her a fortune, standing in Beverly Hills, learning that the fortune was gone. And the lawyer who had handled every transaction she had ever made was already in court, claiming he owned half of what remained. She was 46 years old, and she was starting over.